I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
King Charles had expected resistance from Prince Andrew, but nothing prepared him for the document placed before him that morning. Andrew was no longer simply asking for forgiveness, privileges, or a quiet return to royal life. He was invoking a forbidden clause connected to Prince Philip, an obscure family provision Andrew believed could force the monarch to restore his formal place within the royal household. Charles read the final paragraph, looked up, and his anger erupted. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stared at the submission, anger tightening into something personal. The forbidden royal clause was a family safeguard, a rule meant to guarantee that a senior royal, facing permanent exclusion, would receive a family hearing before the decision became final. Andrew's argument went further. He was demanding restored palace access, ceremonial standing, and participation in family duties, insisting Philip had created a mechanism powerful enough to stop one royal from being erased by another. Camilla entered moments later and saw the change in the king. Charles reached Philip's name, set the folder down so sharply that a pen rolled across the desk, and refused to speak for several seconds. The queen consort asked what Andrew had done. He answered with bitter disbelief. His brother had taken their late father's authority and turned it into a challenge against the crown. What had been a family dispute now felt like an attack on his right to decide who could serve beside him. Andrew's submission carried a more dangerous claim. Attached to a family memorandum, a written record of an internal decision, was a handwritten notation stating that no son of the sovereign should be erased without hearing. The Duke believed those words were his weapon. He was not asking for a Christmas invitation or a quiet place at lunch. He wanted the clause interpreted broadly enough to reopen questions of residence privileges, ceremonial access, and his place at royal gatherings. Charles felt the wound beneath the anger. Philip was gone, yet his name had become the center of a struggle between two sons who remembered him differently. The king pushed back his chair, closed the file with both hands, and turned to his private secretary. "Find the original, not a copy, the original." His order was immediate because everything depended on whether Andrew had preserved Philip's meaning or twisted it. The palace search began at once. Charles believed the original papers would end the challenge, but before he could destroy Andrew's argument, he would have to confront the brother who had convinced himself that Philip had left him one path back inside. For Andrew, this was never just about entering a palace again. It was about refusing to accept that the royal life that had defined him could disappear permanently while the rest of the family moved forward without him. Behind closed doors, he had watched ceremonies continue, decisions pass above his head, and doors close one after another. Now Philip's forgotten words had given him something dangerous, not certainty, but hope powerful enough to become defiance. Andrew had spent months watching Charles tighten control over who could represent the crown, while William stepped into greater responsibility. The crown, in this context, meant the public institution of monarchy, and the official duties carried out in the sovereign's name. To the Duke, every new responsibility handed to the future king felt like proof that the family was learning to function without him. That was what made Philip's clause so powerful. It came from an older royal world, one Andrew remembered as more forgiving, where family loyalty could still challenge cold institutional judgment. Andrew sat opposite a trusted advisor and tapped Philip's name on the page. His voice stayed low, but the bitterness underneath it was unmistakable. He did not want charity from Charles. He did not want a symbolic invitation designed to keep him quiet. He wanted recognition that he remained the son of the late Queen and of Philip, and that blood, history, and decades of service could not simply be erased because the monarchy had moved into a different chapter. Then he said the words that revealed how deeply personal the fight had become. Charles could not rewrite father because it is inconvenient. Charles saw that argument very differently. The king believed his brother was confusing family connection with entitlement, using private bonds to demand public authority. For him, the problem was no longer whether Andrew deserved to be heard. It was whether being heard could somehow become a right to return. That distinction mattered, because royal family events and official royal duties were not the same thing. One belonged to private family life, the other carried public responsibility and the authority of the sovereign. Andrew had prepared for that objection long before the file reached Charles. His submission included a proposed timetable for selected family appearances, carefully spaced to create the appearance of a gradual return rather than a dramatic restoration. The planning showed this was no sudden emotional reaction. He had thought about the route back, step by step, while the king remained unaware that Philip's old words were being turned into a strategy. Andrew had also placed another name inside the submission, Princess Anne. He knew her respect for their father carried enormous weight, and he argued that she could confirm Philip had once defended the principle behind the clause. Anne had not endorsed her brother's return, but her memory now mattered. Charles could dismiss Andrew's interpretation. He could not ignore what his sister might remember. That was the dangerous turn. Andrew believed Philip had written the clause to protect someone exactly like him. But before Charles could decide what those words meant, Anne would have to confront what their father actually intended. And the answer would lead back to one forgotten family confrontation years earlier. The clause had not been created for Andrew. That was the truth hidden beneath years of family silence. Its origin stretched back to one intensely private confrontation, when Prince Philip feared that personal anger inside the monarchy could one day become more powerful than fairness. What happened that evening was remembered by only a handful of people, but it left behind a safeguard written in unusually blunt language. Decades later, Andrew would seize those words and remove them from the reason they existed. Philip had always believed that family punishment became dangerous when nobody was forced to explain it face to face. The clause he created was never constitutional law, meaning it carried no power over parliament, government, or the legal authority of the sovereign. It was an internal family protocol, a private rule intended to guide royal household decisions involving personal exclusion, private gatherings, and reconciliation. That difference would later become crucial, because Andrew was treating the safeguard as though it could restore far more than Philip had ever promised. Everything traced back to Sandringham in 1998. Philip discovered that a senior family member had been removed from a Christmas gathering after a bitter argument, yet nobody had allowed that person to answer the accusation privately. The decision had already hardened into punishment. He was furious. According to a documented family account preserved alongside the later memorandum, the Duke confronted senior household officials that evening and demanded to know how a disagreement had been allowed to become permanent exclusion without a single direct conversation. Anne remembered what happened next with uncomfortable clarity. Prince Philip closed the drawing room door, ordered the two arguing relatives to sit down, and refused to let either leave until both had spoken. She watched her father reject the idea that palace procedure could replace human judgment. His warning stayed with her for years. Discipline could protect the monarchy, but once discipline became personal revenge, the family itself began to fracture. Now Andrew's use of that principle left the princess deeply uneasy. Philip made the safeguard tougher than Andrew seemed willing to admit. The original wording did not promise automatic restoration after a hearing. It required the excluded royal to accept conditions set by the sovereign before any return could even be considered. That condition transformed the meaning completely. Andrew had focused on the right to be heard. He had said far less about the obligation to accept limits afterward. Anne felt the danger immediately. An archive reference pointed to a missing appendix defining the most explosive word in the entire clause: restoration. If Philip meant restoration to private family life, Andrew's strategy was already collapsing. If he meant official royal standing, Charles faced something far more serious. Charles refused to wait for the missing page. The king summoned his brother to a private meeting, determined to discover whether Andrew truly wanted reconciliation, or whether he was using Philip's memory to demand power. With the past suddenly alive again, Charles stopped fighting through paperwork. The next battle would happen face to face. When Andrew entered the room, Charles did not offer him the comfort of small talk. No aides remained. No family photographs softened what was about to happen. The disputed clause sat between the brothers like a third presence. Andrew insisted Philip had left every child of the family a right to be heard. Charles agreed, and then accused him of turning a father's attempt at reconciliation into a weapon against the crown. That was when the conversation broke open. Charles kept his voice controlled at first, because he wanted one answer before anything else. Was his brother asking to be welcomed back into private family life, or was he demanding restoration to official status? The distinction mattered. Personal reconciliation meant repairing relationships inside the family. Institutional rehabilitation meant returning to formal royal duties, ceremonial roles, and public responsibilities carried out in the monarch's name. Andrew refused to separate the two so neatly. To him, exclusion from one had slowly become exclusion from everything. Andrew leaned forward and accused the king of treating him as though he no longer belonged. He argued that blood could not be switched off whenever it became inconvenient, and that Philip had understood that danger better than anyone. Charles listened, but the more his brother spoke, the harder his expression became. Belonging to the family did not automatically create authority, he answered. A son could still be a son without being entitled to represent the monarchy. Andrew pushed harder. He invoked Philip again, then again, insisting their father had written the clause because he feared exactly this kind of permanent rejection. Charles finally leaned across the table. "Do not use father's name against me." The words landed with enough force to stop the argument for a moment. The king was no longer defending only his authority. He was defending his memory of a father, whose legacy Andrew was now trying to turn into leverage. Andrew rose from his chair, anger breaking through the restraint. Charles remained seated, removed his glasses, and told him that standing taller would not make the argument stronger. That was when the Duke revealed what he had deliberately kept back. He possessed an older copy of the clause carrying Philip's personal initials. According to Andrew's documented submission, those initials appeared beside the passage, guaranteeing a hearing before permanent exclusion. Charles did not flinch. The king answered with his own revelation. Palace archivists had found references to a missing appendix, a separate attachment, that could define exactly what Philip meant by restoration. If that page limited the safeguard to private family access, Andrew's entire interpretation could collapse. Neither brother knew that Anne had already been asked to examine the initials on Andrew's copy against other papers Philip signed during the same period. Her judgment now mattered because she understood both their father's habits and her brother's desperation. The confrontation ended without agreement, but the balance had shifted. Andrew still believed Philip had left him a weapon. Charles now suspected the same document might prove the opposite, and the final judgment was moving toward the one person neither brother could easily dismiss. Princess Anne did not want the role being forced upon her. Supporting Andrew could weaken Charles. Supporting Charles without examining Philip's words could betray the principle her father had defended. So she asked for the original archive box herself. Hours later, she sat alone with the old memorandum, Andrew's copied version, and a separate page that neither brother had seen. The argument was no longer about what Philip wrote. It was about what he deliberately refused to promise. Anne remembered the 1998 Sandringham dispute too clearly to dismiss the clause as meaningless. She had heard Philip explain why he wanted a safeguard against permanent family exclusion, and she understood the difference between fairness and automatic forgiveness. The memorandum was simply a private written record of that family principle, not a law that could overrule the sovereign. Charles still controlled official royal participation, while Andrew was arguing that the family procedure forced his brother to reconsider before shutting him out permanently. Anne felt her frustration rise as she compared Andrew's copy with the original papers. He had emphasized every sentence promising a hearing, while giving far less weight to the conditions surrounding restoration. To her, that crossed a line. Philip had wanted powerful people to listen before judging. He had never promised that listening would erase consequences. Andrew was turning a safeguard against revenge into something dangerously close to guaranteed reinstatement. Anne called Charles before making any judgment public inside the family. The king expected support, but she refused to give it blindly. She told him that anger could not decide the matter simply because his brother's tactics had offended him. Philip had created the rule precisely because authority could become personal when emotions ran high. Charles fell quiet. His sister was defending his position while also warning him not to misuse it. Anne then reached the page nobody had been able to locate. The missing appendix, a separate attachment explaining the main document in greater detail, contained the distinction that changed everything. Philip had explicitly separated family reconciliation from service to the crown. She read the paragraph once, then again, before placing her hand flat over the paper. The wording was devastating for Andrew. Reconciliation could restore private family access after agreed conditions were accepted, but no family agreement could compel the sovereign to return public duties, ceremonial authority, or official standing. Philip had protected the right to be heard. He had never created a right to power. Anne felt no triumph. She felt disappointment. Her brother had built his challenge around only half their father's meaning, and Charles now possessed the sentence capable of destroying that argument completely. The king listened as she read the decisive passage aloud. When she finished, silence followed. Charles finally had the answer he wanted. The only question left was how brutally he would use it. The clause had finally been understood, but when Charles acted on that truth, Andrew would discover that winning the right to be heard was never the same as winning his way back. Andrew had demanded a hearing, and Charles gave him one. That should have felt like victory. Instead, the king's decision was devastating in its precision. Philip's clause would be honored, but only as Philip wrote it. Andrew could seek reconciliation as a brother and family member. He could not use that process to restore public duties, command ceremonial standing, or force his way back into the working monarchy. His legal weapon had become a boundary. Charles made the decision formal because anything less would leave room for another challenge. The family review, the private process Philip had created to ensure an excluded royal could be heard, would go ahead and Andrew's position would be acknowledged. But the appendix Anne recovered changed the outcome completely. It separated private reconciliation from official royal service, meaning family access could be reconsidered, while public duties remained entirely under the sovereign's control. The king accepted one part of his brother's argument, and rejected the part Andrew wanted most. Andrew read the first paragraph without speaking. For several seconds, hope returned. Charles had recognized the validity of the hearing, and that alone seemed to prove the clause had mattered. Then he turned the page. The language changed. No restoration of official duties. No automatic ceremonial role. No right to represent the crown. By the time he reached the final section, his expression had hardened into something quieter than anger. Philip's own words had preserved his place as a brother while closing the road back to the royal position he once held. Charles did not soften the truth, but neither did he shut every door. The king offered limited participation in selected private family gatherings if Andrew accepted written conditions and stopped presenting Philip's clause as a path toward public rehabilitation. Public rehabilitation meant a return to recognized duties and appearances performed on behalf of the monarchy. That was exactly what Andrew had been seeking. The offer before him was smaller, more personal, and far more painful to accept. Andrew reached the final page and lowered it slowly. Charles had placed a pen beside the signature line, but his brother did not touch it. He understood what signing would mean. It would give him access to family moments while forcing him to admit that the battle for restored royal status had failed. Pride pulled him one way. Loneliness pulled him another. Charles watched without pressing him. The king had won the institutional argument, yet the silence across the table carried no sense of triumph. Andrew finally stood and left the conditions unsigned. That evening, Anne asked to see him privately. She already knew what Charles had offered, and she also knew exactly why her brother had walked away. The public battle had reached its limit. Now Anne would force Andrew to answer the question he had avoided from the beginning. Did he truly want his family back? Or did he only want his status back? There were no secretaries in the room when Anne sat opposite Andrew that night. No legal phrases, no royal aides, only a brother, a sister, and the shadow of a father whose words had been dragged into a fight he never intended to create. Andrew began by defending himself. Anne let him speak. Then she asked a single question that stopped him completely. If Charles restored none of the privileges, would Andrew still want to return to the family? Anne had reached the point where palace procedure could do nothing more. Philip's clause, she explained, had been designed to force conversation when anger threatened to become permanent separation. It was never a guarantee of victory for whoever invoked it. A family arrangement meant a private agreement governing personal access and relationships, not a command that could force the sovereign to restore official authority. Andrew knew the difference. The harder truth was whether he was willing to accept it. Andrew started defensively. He said years of exclusion had made him feel as though an entire lifetime had been wiped away in a single decision. He had served, appeared, represented, attended, and belonged. Then suddenly, he felt reduced to someone spoken about only in terms of what he could no longer do. His voice slowed. He looked down at his hands and admitted something he had not said to Charles. He was frightened of becoming irrelevant even to his own family. Anne's anger softened, but she did not rescue him from the truth. She told her brother that he had confused dignity with status for too long. Dignity could survive without uniforms, processions, or official invitations. Status could disappear overnight. Philip had understood that difference, and that was why the missing appendix mattered so much. Anne then shared one final detail from the archive record. Beside the appendix, their father had left a handwritten line: "A door reopened is not a throne restored." According to the documented family papers, the note was written after the same Sandringham dispute that inspired the safeguard. Andrew went silent. The words destroyed the last emotional argument that Philip had intended reconciliation to mean reinstatement. Andrew finally admitted what Anne had suspected. He had never been certain the clause could return him to official life. He had pushed the strongest interpretation because he believed Charles would refuse to hear him otherwise. The legal challenge had been partly strategy, partly pride, and partly fear. Anne asked him again what he actually wanted. This time, he answered without hiding behind Philip. He wanted to stop feeling like a stranger to his own family. Andrew agreed to sign the revised arrangement, but he wanted one thing first: a final conversation with Charles, without lawyers or conditions between them. By morning, the royal power struggle had changed completely. Andrew was no longer preparing to demand a title. He was preparing to ask his brother for a place at the family table. By sunrise, the private dispute was no longer private. the story spilled beyond palace walls under one brutal headline: Andrew's Philip Claus fails to force royal return. Cameras gathered outside Buckingham Palace while commentators debated whether Charles had defeated his brother or quietly rescued him from a far more humiliating confrontation. Yet one image captured the public mood better than any debate: a lone man at the palace railings holding an old photograph of Philip beside his sons. Charles watched the coverage for only a few minutes before the weight of it became unbearable. Palace messaging had already confirmed that Philip's family reconciliation principle had been reviewed, but could not compel the restoration of official royal duties. In plain terms, the monarchy was saying that family relationships and constitutional responsibility were two different things. A brother could be welcomed privately without being returned to public service. That distinction protected the king's authority, but it also turned a deeply personal family wound into a national argument. Charles reached for the remote when Andrew's name filled the television screen. Camilla sat beside him and watched his expression tighten before he switched the broadcast off. The Queen Consort said little. She understood that the king was not celebrating. He had defended the monarchy, but he hated seeing Philip's memory dragged through headlines as though their father had become evidence in a courtroom battle between his own sons. Andrew faced the same story from the opposite side. The front pages did not describe a comeback. They described limits. His attempt to prove that Philip's claws could force open the door had instead shown the public exactly how firmly that door remained controlled. The Duke stared at one headline longer than the others, realizing that his strongest challenge had publicly confirmed the boundaries surrounding him. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story took on an almost painful simplicity. Cameras focused on a small gathering near the gates, as one man raised a faded photograph showing Philip beside Charles and Andrew. Broadcasters returned to the image throughout the afternoon because it seemed to capture what speeches could not: a father gone, two sons divided, and duty standing between them. One commentator framed the outcome with brutal clarity. Charles had not rejected family affection, the broadcaster argued. He had refused to let affection become a constitutional obligation. That mattered, because the crown could not operate on blood alone. Public responsibility required boundaries, even when enforcing them caused private pain. Andrew finally stopped fighting that distinction. Away from the cameras, he returned the signed family conditions to Charles. No statement accompanied them. No victory was claimed. His signature said enough. The crowds outside could decide who had won. The newspapers could decide who had lost. But the real verdict still belonged to two brothers facing each other without Philip's claws between them. And that final exchange would determine whether anything remained once the battle for status was over. Andrew returned to Charles without lawyers, advisors, or arguments. The forbidden clause that had threatened to reopen a royal war lay folded inside the folder between them, but neither man touched it. Andrew had finally understood what Philip's safeguard could give him, and what it never could. Charles had understood something too. Defending the monarchy did not require pretending his brother had ceased to exist. What followed was not restoration, victory, or revenge. It was a boundary both men finally accepted. Andrew signed the revised arrangement, knowing exactly what the signature meant. The agreement recognized a path toward private family reconciliation, but gave him no right to resume official royal duties. In simple terms, reconciliation meant being accepted again as a member of the family, while working royal status meant representing the crown in public and carrying formal responsibilities. Charles had agreed to the first under strict conditions. The second remained closed. Andrew pushed the pen toward his brother and hesitated before asking the question that mattered more than any clause. Had Charles ever intended to shut him out personally forever? The king did not answer immediately. Then he told him the anger had never come from the fact that Andrew was his brother. It came from the demands, the pressure, and the attempt to turn Philip's memory into authority over the monarchy. Charles finally admitted how deeply that had wounded him. Hearing their father's name used again and again had made the dispute feel less like a disagreement and more like a battle fought through someone who could no longer speak for himself. Andrew listened without interrupting. For the first time, he did not defend the strategy. Andrew acknowledged what he had done. He had tried to force open a door instead of asking whether there was still a place for him behind it. Family loyalty, he now accepted, could not compel public rehabilitation. Philip had created a right to be heard, not a right to be restored. Charles kept the boundary firm. Andrew would remain outside official royal life, but he could attend agreed private family occasions if he respected the conditions now in place. The monarchy would not bend. The family, however, did not have to break completely. Andrew looked at the signed page, then quietly asked whether he could attend the next private family gathering. Charles held his gaze for several seconds before answering, "As my brother, yes." That answer became the real verdict. Philip's forbidden clause had not restored a prince. It had forced two brothers to separate duty from blood. Andrew left without his old status, but not without a family. Charles kept control of the crown without erasing his brother. The final lesson was simple and absolute. Blood could earn a hearing, but it could never command the crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.